Einat, this is a weird place for me to be. Usually, I'm the counterterrorism person. I come in here and tell you just how terrible it is. But you kind of came in and did the pessimistic, not peace now, not peace yet. I'm going to tell you, maybe counterintuitively, how much better things are than they were on October 8th. Now, we have a long way to go. And there are specific things we need to do to make sure that we don't forego the gains that we have achieved. And I am not convinced that we will necessarily do it or do it right. But there is a tremendous opportunity. And if anybody were to ask anybody in this room, any Israeli officials other than the people who knew about the pagers and the walkie-talkies in advance, asked them if it would be possible to be in the position that we're in today, even just early July last year, if anybody would have said, oh yes, definitely, that they're just lying to you. What Israel accomplished, with help from the US and others to be sure, but what Israel accomplished is something that is unheard of in the history of counterterrorism. You talk to Israeli officials who are involved, and I have. I just, with Einat, flew here this morning from Israel. And many of them will tell you, we didn't know it was going to work. I've met with some of the senior US officials who were involved in working with Israel to defend Israel against Iranian attacks, April and October last. And they told me this was a proof of concept. And going into it, even having been with US Central Command, being in Israel for over a week in advance each time, we didn't know, they said, that it would exist. So it's very easy to stand here today and take a step back and say, yeah, obviously, you know, pagers and walkie-talkies and assassinating Hassan Nasrallah and knocking down Iranian rockets. Sure, obviously. It was not obvious. It was never obvious. It was certainly not obvious that Assad would fall. Nobody saw that coming. But now look where Israel sits. We are not done with Gaza. But Hamas poses not a fraction of the threat that it did to Israel leading up to, and then of course on that fateful day of October 7th and for some time afterwards. I don't believe that Israel is going to destroy Hamas. I believe that total victory is a total slogan. It is not a tactic. It is not a strategy. The United States did not defeat the Islamic State. We inflicted territorial defeat on it. We destroyed its so-called caliphate. And there are still pieces of Islamic State out there. They pose nowhere near the same threat, and we're still going after them. I anticipate it will be the same with Hamas, in part because Hamas is not only in the Gaza Strip. You here in Europe have had, for the first time, Hamas threats here in Europe. And those Hamas threats did not come from the Gaza Strip. They came from Qassam Brigade's leaders sitting in Lebanon. There's a trial going on right now in Berlin and parts in 3 other countries. But I do believe that it is possible to keep Hamas down, to continue to constrict its operating environment, to keep it in a situation where it poses nowhere near the threat to Israel that it did on October 7th. And if you look at Hezbollah in the north, Hezbollah is today a fraction of its former self. I personally do not believe that it will ever become what it was again unless we completely fail. In part, that's because of things like the fall of the Assad regime. The land and air bridge, the highway that was the route from Iran to Lebanon through which Iran funneled money and, more importantly, weapons to Hezbollah is broken. Now, Hezbollah, by the way, you won't read about it in the papers, but Hezbollah is still getting plenty of money into Lebanon. Even though the new Lebanese government is doing some really great things. They have significantly cracked down on Hezbollah operatives controlling security at the Beirut International Airport. No longer are flights coming from Iran or Iraq or even Turkey without getting inspected with people carrying suitcases of cash. But money comes into Hezbollah through money exchange houses, through hawaladars, and we're going to have to do a lot more on that. While we have not yet had the success we want on the money, they're probably getting, by the way, about as much money in today as they were before the war, but their expenses are much, much larger, so it's nowhere near enough. But on the weapons systems, there's tremendous, tremendous progress. Israel took out a significant portion of Hezbollah's rocketry. In fact, Israel effectively significantly degraded the two baskets of threats that Hezbollah has long posed to Israel, these swords of Damocles over Israel's neck. The one are the long-range rockets, and among those in particular, the precision-guided munitions. Not all of these are destroyed, but Israelis say somewhere around 80%. 80% of 100,000 to 150, maybe 180,000 rockets, 20% left. That's still a significant number of rockets. But it means that Hezbollah can't fight a prolonged war shooting hundreds or thousands of rockets at Israel over a long period of time. And that, by the way, we'll get in a minute to, has tremendous implications for Iran, not just for Hezbollah in Lebanon. The second basket is the forward deployed weapons in tunnels, in bunkers, all along the blue line. Far more weaponry forward deployed in caches, not only in homes, where Hezbollah told you, you want to build onto your house, that's fine, but one of the small rooms is going to be ours for rockets, but increasingly in caves, in holes in the ground, under the thick canopy of the trees that are typical to very northern Israel and very southern Lebanon. I was there on Thursday. And you can see very, very clearly just how effective it was for Hezbollah to be able to cache stores of weapons in the forest. Now, I've been going to northern Israel and southern Lebanon for, I don't know, at least 15, maybe 20 years straight. And every year, the Israeli military would brief me on how much more weaponry they believed Hezbollah had stockpiled, on how many more tunnels had been dug in. I've been in Hezbollah tunnels in the north. I've been in multiple Hamas tunnels in the south. And every year I asked them, so I was here last year, it was a lot. I'm here this year, it's more. You and I both know I'm going to come back next year, it's going to be more. So what's the plan? At what point do we address all of this? And their answer always was, both the political and the military directive is keep the calm. So I want to talk a little bit about what calm means. I want to talk a little bit about what time means. And I want to talk a little bit about what rationality means. And I'm not here to give you a philosophy lecture, but I think that these are three really important ideas that we keep getting wrong. And in order to be able to take advantage of the gains that we have seen over the past few months, we're going to have to start getting this right. It's a very, very Western way of looking at the world, to look out the window and see that it's calm out there and interpret that as nothing's happening beneath the surface. This is how you get a situation where the National Security Advisor under the Biden administration, Jake Sullivan, writes an article in Foreign Affairs that comes out days before October 7th that says the region is quieter than it has been in decades. So embarrassing, by the way, that the administration tried to get Foreign Affairs to delete that sentence from the printed edition that came out several weeks later. It was the online edition that came out just before October 7th. And I don't mean to make fun of him. Actually, it had been quite calm. But we all make the mistake of not paying attention to what's happening over the long term, because we look at time differently than our adversaries do. This is why a nut is right, that something happens and then they say, we'll just try again. Now, it doesn't mean they're going to try tomorrow or next week or next year, but I guarantee you that governments here in Europe and my government back in Washington and people in Tel Aviv and Jerusalem are going to look at that and say, well, actually, maybe we got it right this time. I guarantee you that already Hamas, Hezbollah, the Houthis, and most importantly behind them all, Iran, are already preparing for the next round of trying to do something big. I'll give you just an example that I guarantee that almost nobody, maybe than a couple of people in the front row here, are aware of. Last July, almost, many months after October 7th. Hezbollah is very, very concerned about it wants to do things against Israel, but it's very worried about doing too much and eliciting a massive attack from Israel, which obviously is what ultimately happened. But they're still looking for ways to hit Israel hard after October 7th. Iran is pushing them to hit Israel hard, right? So if you look online, you will read about last July, a huge shipment of arms that were seized in Sierra Leone. What you won't read about, but I'll tell you, is that it was Hezbollah. Right? And they were not looking for people other than Jews and Israelis. We need to look at time differently, like our adversaries do, and understand that just because things are quiet in the moment doesn't mean that nothing is happening beneath the surface. The 2006 war with Hezbollah, and then the following year, the 2007 takeover of the Gaza Strip by Hamas, was a long time ago. And in both cases, people looked at these events and said, well, let's see what's going to happen, right? A little bit of calm. And there actually was relatively, if you're looking only at the surface, a significant amount of calm. But now we can look back with 20/20 hindsight, and we see that over a decade and a half more, Hezbollah in Gaza, Hamas in Gaza, and Hezbollah in Lebanon were slowly and meticulously stockpiling weapons which were never intended to be paperweights. They were never intended to never be used. The only question was when and under what circumstance. Now, for Hamas, this actually got a little bit complicated, because for Hamas, it took them a few years to figure out how to navigate governing the Gaza Strip, but pretty soon they figured it out, and they were making a significant amount of money just by governing and taxing, I would call it extorting, Gazan society. By the way, much like the Islamic State did in Syria and Iraq on a much, 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 much bigger level. Everybody paid attention there to the fact that the Islamic State was wealthy because of sitting on top of natural resources, which is true, but their second most significant income was taxing everybody, extorting it 1,000 times over. By about October 7th, we believe that Hamas was getting about $120 million a year from Iran. We believe that Hamas was making about $500 million a year by running the Gaza Strip. And so this creates a little bit of a push and pull. Do we go now? Do we not go now? And I think it's very, very clear that two main things drove Hamas to do what it did when it did it. And I wrote this 3 days after October 7th in Foreign Affairs. One, which you can read about today in the Wall Street Journal, is they clearly were very, very, very concerned about the prospect of normalization. The prospect of normalization was real. Other countries, including Indonesia, the most populous Muslim country on the earth, were thinking about how do we follow that. If Saudi Arabia were to normalize with Israel, there'd be a cascading effect. But that is a precipitant event right then and there. Hamas had already been planning for something like this, and I think it was something much more fundamental. The prospect of normalization made them say, no, now we got to go now. The underlying issue was this. Hamas looked at its last rocket war with Israel and saw how time and again there would be a rocket war, there'd be a clash from protests along the fence, they'd send incendiary balloons and start a fire in a field, and then there'd be a short war, and they'd go to the Europeans and the Americans to get reconstruction aid, and every time that aid would be less, because even the Europeans, I sat in meetings in Brussels, understood that, wait, last time I funded this building, and I have a satellite, it shows me that building hasn't been rebuilt, but you reported that it was. What are you doing with that money? Each one of the tunnels they dug was about $3 million. We know what they did with that money. And so Hamas looked at themselves and they said, listen, are we, as Einat said, give them credit, are we the real deal or are we not? Because if all we want, if we're going to be satisfied with jumping up and punching Israel in the nose every 12, 18, 24 months and drawing a little bit of blood and saying, yes, we are resistance, look at us, then great, we got it made. But if we are true believers and what we really want is to destroy Israel, then this is not enough. And we cannot let our governance project take precedence. By the way, no fools, they engaged on what I am not pleased to admit to you is one of the greatest intelligence coups of the century convincing Israelis from the top to the analysts deep inside the bowels of Israeli security agencies that they did prioritize their governance project and that they were deterred. So that when I went to Israel after the last rocket war that Israel suffered before October 7th, which was started not by Hamas, but by Palestinian Islamic Jihad. And I said to them, I don't understand. Why did Hamas not get involved in this at all? They said, Matt, we keep telling you. We've got their number. They're deterred. They prioritize their governance project. For Israeli analysts, Hamas not participating in the Islamic Jihad rocket war was proof that they were right all along, when in fact, it was just that Hamas knew they had something much bigger planned. They didn't want to spark something that would cause the Israelis to drop a lot of bombs and maybe hit the things they'd been preparing. It was the exact opposite of how they interpreted it, with an element of selection bias. Look at Hezbollah in the north. Hezbollah, ever since it withdrew from Syria, was trying to figure out a way to resurrect its resistance credentials, to scratch its resistance itch. But Nasrallah knew that if he did something too much, the Israelis were going to hit him really hard. It led, actually, you may recall, to this kind of two little children in the sandbox yelling at each other through the media, no, I'm going to send you back to the Stone Age. And then an Israeli official says, no, I'm going to send you back to the Stone Age. And Nasrallah sends drones over Haifa and releases those footage, and then the Israelis do something similar. He was looking for a way to be able to do something against Israel without sparking too much of a response. So he flies an unarmed drone, though of course we didn't know it was unarmed at the time, over the Karish oil field. The Iranians send a shipment of oil to Lebanon, which wasn't going to solve their process. It was great PR and nothing more than that. And Nasrallah says, I consider that boat to be Lebanese territory. Because remember, there were rules in the game. As long as the Israelis didn't strike in Lebanon or didn't kill a Hezbollah guy in Syria or elsewhere, Hezbollah wasn't responding. The Israelis were hitting weapon shipments in Syria all the time. Hezbollah wouldn't respond. But this ship, he said, I see this as Lebanese sovereign territory, meaning you hit that, I'm going to respond. He's looking for ways. He infiltrates a terrorist operative 60 kilometers into Israel, who isn't very good at his job and thankfully only kills one person. And then October 7th comes and he sees his opportunity. You and I understand that there's no legitimacy of any kind in saying, I am participating in defense of Palestinians alongside Hamas. That is not a legitimate argument. But for him, it was extremely effective. And everybody I've spoken to in Israel, in the United States, in Europe, everybody took him at his word, because I think he meant it when he said, I am not going to stop until the war in Gaza stops. And it's only because the Israelis were able to put together the kind of intelligence and the kind of operations that, frankly, nobody, myself included, as a former US intelligence official, thought possible, that we are where we are. The bigger piece of this is that it's not just each of these individual proxies of Iran that is a little bit on the ropes. Hamas, obviously, even Hezbollah, the Shia militias in Iraq, which for a period of time were launching drones at Israel and now are not. Even the Houthis are finding out that there's severe consequence to continuing to shoot drones and rockets at Israel, though it's become a little more difficult because the United States agreed to a truce of its own with the Houthis, and frankly, to be blunt, threw Israel under the bus. But if you look at what's happened with Iran, which is the sponsor of all these groups, it's really tremendously impressive. Keep in mind, not Hamas, not Hezbollah, not the Houthis, and a whole bunch of other terrorist groups whose names don't start in H, none of them would be anywhere as effective if it were not for Iran's money and weapons, but over a very long period of time. And so moving forward, we need to address that. We need to, however quickly we do or don't resolve Gaza, we need to make sure that the Hamases and the Hezbollahs and the Houthis are not able to get rockets and drones and money as easily as they have been for all of this time. When Israel responded to the Iranian direct attack on Israel, which was unprecedented in April, and then in October, they had tremendous success, especially the second time, where Iran fired ballistic missiles, which made that attack much scarier because it's a much faster turnaround. The first attack in April, it involved drones, which go about the speed of a fast car. And it involved low-altitude cruise missiles, which go about the speed of a civilian airliner. And then it also involved ballistic missiles, which go up and down in, 19 to 20 minutes. The second attack was only ballistic missiles, which gave a much shorter period of time to respond, to defend Israel. But then when Israel responded, it took out almost all of the most sophisticated air defense systems around Tehran and some other key locations. It is not the case that Iran is without any air defenses. But they are basically, they're not playing, you'd call it football, I'd say soccer, but I'm here. They're not playing football without a goalie, but they're playing football with a 5-year-old goalie. And on top of that, they are unable, how long this we don't know will last, but they are for the moment unable to produce ballistic missiles as they once could, because the Israelis also took out one facility in the corner of one base that happened to be the one place where Iran produced a particular specific component for the ballistic missiles, without which the ballistic missile won't go. So how long it takes them to be able to fix that, I don't know. But for a period of time anyway, every ballistic missile shot is not a ballistic missile that can be replaced. And then finally, circle back to Hezbollah. Iran provided Hezbollah these huge number of rockets and these sophisticated smart rockets that can be shot not at a town or a community or a city block or a building, but a window, in part to be able to be a first line of defense to deter Israel or the United States or anybody else from attacking their nuclear program. And Hezbollah no longer has that capability the way they once did. Now, I'll be very, very honest with you. I am very concerned that we are about to have not a deal with Iran, but a bad deal with Iran. My concern is that we're going to have a framework agreement, a partial deal. My concern is that despite the fact that President Trump criticized the JCPOA the first time around, in part because it didn't deal with terrorism, that this one is not going to deal with terrorism at all. And it's going to be complicated. But it means we have all the more reason to understand, A, our adversaries look at time differently than we do. And when we see that after October 7th, maybe, please God, things are a little bit more calm for a period of time, that doesn't mean things aren't happening right now, not only in Sierra Leone, but in terms of trying to resurrect the capabilities of Hamas proxies and maybe build others. And it means we need to address the crisis of how we assess rationality. And it's because of this issue of rationality that we get to a point where there could be a bad deal with Iran. Too many people look at Iran and say they're irrational. If you look at them from a Western perspective, the way we define rationality, too many people look at them and say they're irrational. They are extremely rational. So are the Chinese, so are the Russians, so are the North Koreans. But they have a different type of rationality, which ultimately comes down to how you assess risk and benefit. I'll just speak as an American. In America, we're extremely risk averse. And we only do things if we have overwhelming power and if the benefits are pretty much guaranteed. Iran and others, Russia, China, North Korea, the reason we keep assessing these countries wrong is we keep assessing whether or not they're acting rationally by whether or not they're acting based on the way we assess risk, the way we assess benefit. But if you're dealing with a country like Iran that is willing to assume more risk for less guaranteed benefit, and let's be blunt, if it's willing to have its proxies assume more risk for less benefit. Iran is famous for being willing to fight to the last Arab. Then they will act differently, which is why the Israeli counterstrikes on Iran were so important. Iran, at the end of the day, has one red line. It does not want this instability this regional instability that it has created and fostered to boomerang back across the borders of Iran. Because the regime isn't all-controlling, and they have a youth bulge, and not everybody there is a hardline theological Islamist, and they understand that. And so it puts them in a unique position that I fear a bad deal will save them from. The reason they want a framework agreement and don't care if it's more is because they feel the threat, the military threat, very strong right now because they're so weak. The IRGC sold the Ayatollah a tale. We can hit the Israelis hard and we can defend the homeland. And they were unable to hit Israel hard, and they were certainly unable to defend the homeland. Iran wants a deal that's going to take that off the table. Iran is also facing tremendous, tremendous financial hardship. And even if this deal is not going to be one that's going to enable Iran to be readmitted into the international financial system, if it's not going to end all sanctions, if all it does is inject a significant amount of cash into Iran, that'll be enough for Iran. And this should be a huge matter of concern for you and for me. If you walk around and talk to people in the Trump administration in Washington, which I do, they will tell you, now is the time, right now, to push for a deal with Iran because they're weak, because they're vulnerable. And part of my answer to them is if it's a good deal, fine. But don't rush into a deal. Don't want it more than they do. Don't give them the financial injection, the safety from the threat of attack that will enable them and their proxies to recuperate. At the end of the day, we watched UNIFIL, the United Nations interim force in Lebanon, literally watched as Hezbollah dug tunnels and built infrastructure and built arms caches right across the border, right across the blue line, literally under UNIFIL's noses, and people described this as calm. So now we've learned the very, very, very hard way that you cannot let people who are dedicated to your destruction and who say it openly to accumulate the weapons and tools necessary to try and do that. Because ultimately, at some point, they're going to use them. So, look, the stuff that ain't not deals is too complicated for me. I went to graduate school thinking I was going to be the next Dennis Ross. I now work with Dennis Ross, and I go up to him in the hallway all the time and say, thank God I didn't follow in your footsteps. I deal with something tangible. We can make a difference, and we can curtail some terrorism. But in the interim, we have a lot of terrorism to curtail. And because I don't think we're going to solve Gaza in any complete way and anytime soon, it will remain a festering wound that radicals and violent terrorists will use to their advantage. Just this week, Al-Qaeda, forget ISIS, old school Al-Qaeda, put out a big glossy thing about the need to carry out terrorism specifically against Jews around the world and against Israelis in Israel because of what's happening in Gaza. You can agree with them, you cannot agree with them, I certainly don't agree with them. It will be effective propaganda. So we have a tremendous amount of work that we need to do. If you want to keep Iran and its proxies down, we need to now, in ways we never thought the need to before because it was calm, to put together a much more coherent and proactive effort, multinational effort, to constrict Iran's ability to finance and arm its proxies. Because at the end of the day, intent plus capability equals threat. I don't believe that I'm going to be capable of changing the intent of everybody who seeks to do wrong to me, to you, to Israel, maybe at the periphery, but we sure as hell can do a lot more about their capability. That means aggressively targeting their ability to do what they want to do, their ability to have the tools to do what they want to do, and also not being complacent. And we now know that Israel, when it came to Gaza by October 7th, was pretty damn complacent. And it's painful to say. It's not going to happen again, I can guarantee you that. But what happens in a year, or 5 years, or 10 years? It's human nature for complacency to start to sneak in again. And so we're going to have to hold our own feet to the fire and remind ourselves that so long as there are people who are committed to our destruction, and so long as those people have any type of capabilities at all, we are going to have to do all we can to thwart and frustrate those efforts. At the end of the day, you know, it's weird for me to follow a knot and for her to be the one to say, kind of in a way, how bad things are, and for me to tell you that when it comes to our adversaries' capabilities, we've made tremendous progress. Progress that if I had stood here a year ago, I would never in a million years have suggested we would have achieved. But we have. And so now we need to capitalize this in some very, very creative ways. I want to, before I finish, I do want to thank the translators who are the silent heroes in a conference like this, especially for people like me who speak in English. Thank you. And I want to say a mazal tov and a congratulations. This organization does tremendous work for 50 years. And when I'm talking about the fact that we need people and organizations who are going to do the types of things that I'm asking us to do, this is the type of group I'm thinking about. So thank you for what you do. Thank you all for being here. Thank you very much.
Matthew, thank you very much. We have some Q&A.
Yeah, I'm just going to drink some vodka.
Of course. Oh, the vodka, yeah.
You can't convince me in this bottle this is water.
So, your president, Donald Trump, I mean, he wants to get, in a way, maybe is the crown of his work, the Nobel Prize. He's very aching for peace in Ukraine, also in the Middle East. How big is the chance that your president, with his staff, with Witkoff, wants so much the peace process with Iran that he signs a bad deal?
So, look, I think that more than a Nobel Peace Prize, though it does clearly irk him that President Obama got one just for not being the previous guy before he did anything, and that President Obama had the Abraham Accords and didn't get one. I think more than that, President Trump this time around wants to do other things and be in other places. He wants the things that have perpetually, from his perspective, dragged America down to be over. I don't think enough people understand how badly he wants the Gaza war done, whether it's actually done or just declared done. And I'm not sure people appreciate how badly he wants to have a deal with Iran. If you look at the parameters that we've been told about publicly, and I've had some meetings with some people privately, at best we're talking about the JCPOA, and we're probably talking about JCPOA minus. You have a real push and pull, a tug of war within the administration between what some people describe as the new neocons. You and I would think of them as the traditional Republican foreign policy people, hawks or otherwise, and the isolationists who are ascendant, and in the case of some, have a long-held concern that Israel will drag America into a war that America doesn't want. So I think that there's plenty of strong argument to push back against that and to help shape the president's foreign policy in a way that doesn't take that tack. I'm very confident about that. What I'm not confident about is that there will be a good deal. I think, and I would love to be wrong. You can all email me and say you said it and you're wrong, and I will be happy. But I think there will be a bad deal.
So why would there be a bad deal? Is that a way of wanting it too much, having too little time to get a good deal?
Yes, I think that Iran has its own timetable, as I explained. It wants the threat of military strike off the table at a point when its defenses are down. It really, really needs money. It's got a huge environmental crisis it needs to deal with, et cetera. But I think that the Trump administration wants one at least as badly because it wants out. He wants to be able to pivot away from things that have dragged down all of his predecessors, Democrats and Republicans alike. And I think he feels that in his first administration, which maybe arguably it's because he didn't think he was going to win, but this time he did, and he did the groundwork beforehand, that the first time around he wasn't ready to kind of break as fiercely with prior policy. And you can see that on a whole host of issues, right? Immigration, the deep state, firing federal workers.
So he's in a hurry.
I think he is, because I think he's not in a hurry to be somewhere as much as he's in a hurry to be done with things to not be somewhere.
Okay. Question. You talked about southern Lebanon, you talked about UNIFIL. This is the question, so to what extent is the UN to blame for their blue helms in southern Lebanon doing nothing when Hezbollah was digging the tunnels?
Look, I think UNIFIL has a lot of explaining to do. To be fair, when we say UNIFIL did nothing, UNIFIL's first response is going to be, my mandate was never to do anything. And to be fair, that's true. I think that mandate should have been changed, but fine. Their mandate was to observe and report. And they did that very, very, very poorly, if at all. And so even in their reports, they'll report that some local civilians stopped us from our patrols from going where they wanted. They won't even say the word Hezbollah. They're little green men, some that appear in the air. We've been critical of them for that for a long time. I and many others have written about this almost every year leading up to August when the renewal vote for UNIFIL comes about at the UN. But when you go now and you realize the extent to which Hezbollah was able to move completely freely, the extent to which, in violation of UN Security Council Resolution 1701, they were walking around. At first it was, they'd have their gun kind of strapped to their belt but have a shirt untucked. And then they started carrying guns around very, very openly. You remember, kind of hard to remember now, so much has happened, but before the war, we had this big diplomatic brouhaha because Hezbollah set up blue tents on the Israeli side of the no man's land and said, if you do something, that'll be an act of war, right? Complete failure of UNIFIL at every level, again, not to stop, but even just to observe and report what was being done. The Hezbollah tunnel that I've been in, it's not like the Hamas tunnels in the south in very, very soft terrain. This is rock. They had to get cylindrical diggers to dig a cylindrical piece at a time, and it goes down about 4 stories underground, carved into the rock, and you can see UNIFIL right there.
Unbelievable.
This makes noise. There's no not seeing it. There's no not hearing it.
So they saw it, they hear it, they see it going on, and they don't ring a bell.
And at the end of the day, I think they felt that in order to be there, they had to balance, or they wouldn't be able to do what little of a job they were doing. If you look at UNIFIL's social media feed today, they're trying to justify themselves by showing all the wonderful, and it is wonderful, things they do for the local population in southern Lebanon. There's a medical clinic, we gave vaccines, we gave this, but that's not their mission. You do that stuff to build some level of trust with the local community so you can do your mission. If you're not doing your mission, don't justify your existence to me by saying that you're running medical clinics. If that's what the UN wants, then the UN should have a UN interim medical clinic in Lebanon instead of UNIFIL and call it what it is. But the debate right now is there any added value or are they just in the way? And the reason, frankly, the IDF, the Israeli military, were the ones who kept saying to the United States and others, actually, for all their flaws, and there are some things we'd like to be fixed, we want them to stay until now is because there was a mechanism for the Israel Defense Forces and the Lebanese Armed Forces to communicate through UNIFIL. And in about an hour and a half, 2 hours, IDF could provide them information and they could take care of it, typically not by force, but by saying, hey, guys, stop what you're doing. The Israelis know about it. And now there's a different mechanism. Because of the ceasefire, there's a US-led mechanism with a US general, and that mechanism doesn't take an hour to an hour and a half to share information. That information typically goes in 15 to 30 minutes, and things happen. So you might say to me, well, President Trump is more known for pulling US forces out of the Middle East than keeping them there. And even though this US mechanism only includes about 20 people, you know, should we say UNIFIL go home because we have this mechanism? How sure are you that this mechanism is going to stay? And I can't answer that question.
Understood. Because Iran is such the most important supplier of these terrorist groups, there's a question: do you see a democratic revolution in Iran possible? The million-dollar question. Yeah.
No, I'm sitting here, I'm like, do I tell them the truth or do I make the audience happy? No.
No.
Which is not to say ever, because it will happen, all right? But I think anybody who banks on a near-term political change all the way to revolution in Iran as the thing that's going to get us out of this morass, out of this difficult situation, is just playing on hope. I know there are people in the room who knew Uri Lubrani, who was the last Israeli ambassador to Tehran, and then even when he was quite old, maintained an office in the Kiryat, an IDF headquarters, focused on these things. And I used to go see him. I knew him for many, many years. And, you know, even when I was a graduate student, I was this young Jewish kid, and here's this grandfather-aged guy, and he'd do the whole cheek thing to me every time, and just grab me by the cheek, tell me, no, Matt, I'm telling you, 12 to 18 months. 12 to 18 months go by, I go see, you know, I used to call him Saba Lubrani, and I'd say, you know, Uri, happen. Matt, I'm telling you, we're right there. I believe it's going to happen. The dynamics are such, the youth bulge is such, the economics are such, it's just not sustainable. But there's not really true elections in this country. There's a pseudo-elected element. Yeah. And the people who hold all elements of power are the revolutionary unelected. And so long as they are willing and able to deploy their intelligence, security, and the Basij militia, who are just thugs, to literally crack skulls of Iranian students, Iranian young women who are willing to take off their head coverings, then they're going to have enough intimidation to prevent widespread rebellion. Again, if I am wrong tomorrow or next week or next month, I want all of you to email me and tease me, and I will love it. I would love to be wrong. But don't bank on this as part of the solution to get out of this immediate problem.
Okay. So going back to Iran as maybe a deal, maybe a good deal, maybe a bad deal, but what is the role of the EU, the European Union, in this? Is there a role for this part of the world?
Look, there absolutely is a role on the part of the EU, and I've seen significant progress since October 7th, especially by law enforcement and intelligence agencies who tend to be the type of people I interact with. And so even in European governments that are vocally very critical of Israel, you can go to some of those law enforcement and intelligence agencies and they're doing some really good stuff. There are a whole bunch of very, very serious law enforcement cases against Hamas financiers, Hezbollah operatives going on within the EU. The EU has really come to an understanding about Iran, not only because of October 7th, and not only because the Israelis have shared with just about all the EU countries the extent of the intel that they've collected on what Hezbollah was doing in the southern Lebanon, but also because Iran, separate from that, has really picked up the pace of its international foreign operations, assassination plots, abduction plots, intimidation plots. I actually run a data set on this, and we have an interactive map on these Iranian plots around the world on our website. We also have one on Hezbollah activities. You can go to our website, washingtoninstitute.org. It's free. We track these. And a whole bunch of European countries are really concerned about this. Look, I think of the last time I spoke at one of your conferences for this organization, that day, the Iranians hired someone to kill someone in The Hague, which is where we had the conference that day. So that too has gotten Europeans more animated on the Iran issue, and yet you have a situation where there are European countries who are actually telling Washington, you're not being hard enough on Iran on the negotiations. But if there is a negotiation that is in any way successful, I anticipate that the EU and its member states will say, look, we didn't make the deal, but this is the deal. Meanwhile, it's the EU that is effectively putting an additional time pressure on the negotiations by saying, look, the snapback is October. To do that, we'd really need to put things in place by, let's say, late July, and we're serious about it. And I think the Iranians are quite concerned about that, which is one reason why they're in a rush.
Okay. Matthew, thank you very much.